If you were watching Q&A television program last week, you would have seen and heard Professor Dawkins and Australia's own Archbishop or Cardinal George Pell talking. They were not discussing, they were talking. Talking about the existence or the non-existence of God. Talking about Hitler being so bad that it was necessary surely for him to be punished eternally in hell. Why only Hitler, as it were? Or rather, he should go through a time of purification. Wherever that idea came from, I don't know. But the cardinal said that that's what he favoured. Yes, here were two highly educated people talking about heaven and hell, as if they were still teenagers, trying to make sense of those beliefs, those strange beliefs of religion. They talked about life after death, which always seems to me to be somewhat of an oxymoron. When you're dead, you're dead. No life after that. They talked about the resurrection of Jesus, immortality, and even moved to the resurrection of the dead at the last day of judgment. I thought we'd given up that Humpty Dumpty kind of theology long ago. How can we possibly intelligently believe in the resurrection of the dead on the last day of judgment? It's a fiction, and we ought to say so. More than once, the audience in the studio laughed at some comment, I thought reasonably appropriately. But twice, Professor Dawkins snapped at them and said, "What's funny about that? What's funny about that?" Well, the whole program was so serious that I thought it was terribly funny. We know all this stuff. You know it all. How can you prove God exists? What is this crass nonsense about being punished in hell, when years ago we gave up the idea of hell down there, heaven up there, the three-tiered view of the universe? If you read Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, it describes Dante's experience as he struggled on his pilgrimage through hell. But every reader knows it was fiction. Is it anything other than fiction when a cardinal of the church stumbles through his beliefs about being punished by a judgmental God in hell? What age are we living in? For me, it was so outdated that I had to force myself to watch, knowing that some people would ask me, "Did you watch it?" But I punished myself for nothing because only one person, which might have meant that they didn't know about it, they didn't mean to watch it, or it was so boring that it didn't require a comment, or they thought that my view wouldn't be worth having anyway, which is quite reasonable. Well, Professor Dawkins and Cardinal Pell talk now and again about evolution. Indeed, Dawkins hankered to get his teeth into the story of Adam and Eve and original sin, but we were spared. But evolution, the critical thing for me was here were two men trained in the very best universities in the world. But in matters of faith and religion, they had not evolved since they were university undergraduates. If you want a strong case for the evolution of a new faith, there it was, loud and clear. Who can believe this nonsense, this archaic nonsense of a wrathful God watching over us and will punish us if we're bad? Why, George Pell was asked, will an atheist go to heaven? And he said, of course. So I thought, well, why are we bothering with all this discussion? It was all that confusion stuff that was going on. In this address today, I want to look at issues of living and dying and the new faith. as was advertised long before that television program. Does the new faith that I advocate provide us with relevant, intelligent, and intelligible resources to live life while we have it? And does it help us to die a good death? Does it have the resources to expand our experience of life and our acceptance of the realities of our illnesses, of our sufferings, of our dying, of our mortality? Because these are the givens of life. We are all going to die. We are all marked with the brush of mortality, not immortality. How will we do it? So to discuss these matters, I'm going to talk a little bit candidly about my own experiences and my own role as I meet with people who are going through the stages of their dying. What I frequently find is that people do not talk about their dying until it is too late. Well, that's a contradiction too, isn't it? They've left it too late. In fact, that's what the Dying with Dignity cause is also about. Will you talk about it, arrange about your death before you get to that point? Sometimes too late. Dr. Stanley Kellerman, a psychiatrist in the United States, wrote this book, Living Your Dying. Notice that? Living Your Dying. And he said there, he asked these questions. What do you imagine death is? Do I talk about it? Or do I keep silent? What kind of talking about dying do I do to myself or to others? Again and again, he asks the disturbing question, do I die as I live? That is to say, if I live an angry life, will I die an angry death? Sometimes I see that happen. If I come to some level of peace with my demands and my anxieties in life, will I die a peaceful death? Sometimes I see that happen. But they are difficult questions in any particular case. I mention in my book that I wrote on discovering wisdom and contentment of a man who was dying, and as he was dying, he said to his wife, standing not far from him, I will soon be with my little Peter Pan. His wife was furious, was confused, was dreadfully upset. Their little Peter Pan had died nearly 40 years earlier, and he had doggedly refused to ever talk about it. And they'd had 2 more children, never talked about it, until at this moment. So it was as if he had lived his life, those 40-odd years, in an impacted grief. And he died with an impacted grief. My first experience of death, I described it in my book, I Feel the Eagle's Heart. Although most of the book is really about other things, I was using snippets of my own experience in that book. And the relevant point for this address was that terrible, unjust, violent death of the family cat. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. Then soon after that, in my very early years in primary school, there was a knock on the door of that tiny school, and there was some commotion outside taking place. And then 3 of the children inside, I think they were aged about 11, 8 and 5, 3 sisters, were rushed out the door. And we were told that their mother, who had had no previous illness, had died that morning. Those 3 girls left the school that day and were never seen again. Now there is something of the devastation and anxiety and confusion about death that swept across those northern plains. And I doubt whether too many people have even yet come to terms with what death might mean. I take a huge leap forward in time. I presided at my first funeral, supervised by a Roman Catholic priest, would you believe it? And that took place in Stanley, Tasmania. Later, I buried an old man in 6 feet of snow in the north of Scotland. Then on the ship carrying me to this country from the United Kingdom, 3 times at midnight, I stood at the ship's railings and said the words before we slipped a body into the Mediterranean Sea and later into the Indian Ocean. And now another step forward in time. I'm called. Sometimes the person is already dead, and so the family calls me. Sometimes the person is dying, and they may have weeks to live or hours to live. Some lie staring at the wall, silent. Some are strafed by terrible distress and pain. Some clasp hold of me as if in fear. There are those who are dying too soon. A 14-year-old girl dying with cystic fibrosis has asked especially to see me. A 5-year-old dying of a vicious cancer asks me to comfort her parents. Some are dying a lonely death, even with seven or eight people around them. Some are dying but refuse to admit they're dying until I enter the room. I remember one such example, but many could be called, when the family were in total disarray when I arrived outside the dying room because they feared he didn't know, he didn't realize what was happening. But as soon as I stood at his bedside, he said, "I'm dying." Some have lost all control of their life in dementia or in incontinence. Others, like Jim, in this excellent book by Dr. Rodney Syme, it's called A Good Death. Jim knew he was dying, and he took control of his dying. Wrote Rodney Syme, "The last phase of the dying person's life should be celebrated, not regretted. But some die in such extreme pain, uncontrolled discomfort, in spite of every effort of palliation. Some die with no dignity left at all. Well might we talk of dying with dignity. And so I'm called to visit. I'm in an extraordinary, privileged position. I'm there as a minister, and I'm there as a psychotherapist with long experience in both professions. In many instances, I have never met the dying person before. In others, I've known them for 40 years. In some instances, I've known and had dealings with every member of the family. Even so, this visit is never simple, often unpredictable. But if the outcome is good, that visit is a time of enormous significance and appreciation for all of us. So what happens? What happens? I tell you these things because I think it's important. We're all will be in the process of dying one day. And so it's important that we think about these things beforehand and talk about them if you can, or realize that talking can be a great therapy, even in the last hours. Invariably, the people who call me know that I'm not going to gabble off words from the Bible or prayers from the prayer book. My presence is the first important thing. That's what they asked for. That's what I'm there for. With my own anxiety in hand as much as possible, I stand beside, I wait, I observe, I listen, I say nothing, until I hear where the person is in their living and their dying. I bring my silence. And then I might ask the question, are you comfortable? I listen to assess if they are aware of what is happening. And I ask if there is something they'd like to say to me. Some say nothing for a time, but if I wait, I know they all have something to say. Some express regrets that have never been grown through. Some express hopes for the people who will live on after they've died, even though they've never spoken to the people concerned about their hopes. Some are understandably fearful. Some terribly lonely as the experience of death is approaching. Some know and are waiting for death to take its course. Jack Berkeley, whom we had the funeral for the other day, his son-in-law spoke to him the day before he died. Jack Berkeley spent 6 years in the Second World War, 4.5 years in the Libya desert, a rat of Tobruk. Thereafter he went to Alamein. Thereafter he went to the jungles of New Guinea. What a life. And many of the experiences lived with him all his days until he was 92. But he made something of his life. So his son-in-law in the last day said to him, "What do you feel, Jack?" And Jack replied, "I have been blessed." Yes, people have their regrets. Some have their gratitude. Some have their anxiety. But some here have taken hold of the words that they've heard in this place many times, that they are accepted and blessed. That is why our new faith idiom, our new faith words stand in such contrast to that deductive old faith that would impose on us a sense of guilt, non-acceptance, judgment. No. How many times do I say it? Accepted and blessed. I sat next to a hospital bed of a man who'd been my minister in my youth. Now, that was a very difficult situation for me. I knew he held me in good regard, but that was only a fraction of the regard in which I held him. He was dying. He knew it, and I knew it. Hesitatingly, I asked him if he would like me to bring him the sacrament. He said, no. And after a pause, he said, I'm ready. I am slowly living my dying. I'm living, I'm living, I'm living, I'm living my dying. As I visit in these times, it may be the family would like me to say a prayer, but I try to avoid that, because I think that's their way of easing them at trying to escape the importance of this present moment. Religion often grabs onto this situation with its words, its assurances. Many even have views of angels coming to carry the person away. And I like the imagery. It's beautiful imagery. I mentioned it in my book of that great, beautiful song, "Coming to Carry Me Home." The imagery is good, but we're looking at the fact of death. So today, what will I say? I remember one dying person. Her husband was on one side of the bed and I was on the other when her tumour burst. Her tumour burst. And she was at once convulsed in her need to keep breathing. And in the anxiety of the moment, she clasped in every direction. And we're able to say the most powerful words that could ever be said to a dying person: "We are here beside you." That dying person had talked with me a great deal beforehand. And I like to think that we could all hear Mozart's Piano Concerto number 27, second movement, which I'd commended to her many times. I thought it would be good for us all to hear that at that moment. Usually I ask the family and friends to leave as I bend over the dying person and say the words that only they should hear at that time. And many die soon afterwards. Rodney Syme, in his book, rightly says that Dylan Thomas's poem to his dying father is great poetry, but wrong advice at such a time. You know the poem, do you? "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." Great words. But better words, I think, at that moment, infused into my mind from Mendelssohn's Elijah oratorio, "Rest in the Lord. Wait patiently for him." And that is a way of saying we all do our best living and our best dying as we become part of that good spirit of the ages, fully accepted, fully blessed. Jesus said, "Into your hands I commend my spirit. Rest in the Lord, wait patiently for him." The New Faith says God is that good spirit in your life, in the world. Believe in that good spirit. Forget all the attempts to prove God exists or doesn't exist. Believe in a good spirit. Hear me say it again. If you believe in the good spirit, that's another word for God, because God is a word. Not a God up there in judgment, ready to meter out punishment. God, the good spirit, accepts us, enriches, inspires, and heals somewhere there. Faith is not a raft of beliefs that you've got to believe in your dying time, nor even in your living time for that matter. Faith, the new faith, the energy of faith, helps us to live our life well and helps us to die our death as a good death. Would you stand? And here is the blessing for this day. The blessing speaks about God in all creation. But here again, the word is an expression of the good Spirit. May the God you see in all the colours of creation arouse in you a sense of awe and wonder. May the God who is a sacred presence be real to you. May the God who is a source of inspiration and courage keep calling you forward. May your God go with you and bless you today and always.